Hi, Misha here, and it's time to revisit and go way over into detail on the Japanese Type 38. We know it as the Arisaka, and I'm sure most of you know by now that's kind of erroneous. This was not designed by later Baron Arisaka, but actually later General Nambu, and based on his work with the Type 35. Nevertheless, we call them Arisakas, and to be fair, it does fire the 6.5 by 50 Arisaka round, so it is what it is. And these are really nicely made guns. First adopted in 1905 and serviced very soon after. This served all the way through World War II. So we've got the basic long rifle here with a 31 and some change barrel, overall 50 inches. The carbine with a 19-inch barrel and a foot shorter at 38 inches. These would be pretty much put in service together as a pair. Infantry here, cavalry and engineers and whatnot here. And then 5 years later, in 1911, they were joined by the Type 44, which was really specifically made for the cavalry, although later other units, mechanized units, perhaps even airborne would use these because production would last for quite a long while, although numbers were quite low. Very unique and specialized variant. It also has a 19-inch barrel like the carbine, but because of the assembly it is much heavier. And then finally, one of the rarer guns in my collection, the Type 38 so-called cavalry rifle, or we can just call it a Type 38 short rifle. This has a 25-inch barrel and was a rework in the 1930s by Nagoya to try to make these of a little more utility for use in China and later the Pacific. So I think I've got a pretty good spread here for you. These are just the ones used by Japan. I might cover some more of the oddball guns in a separate video. But with that, let's dive in back in the early 20th century. The Type 38. As you know, it was named after the 38th year in the Meiji reign, which was 1905, although in reality full production in the first deliveries to the Japanese Army and later Navy would not begin until 1906. And as I'm sure you also know, this is not the brainchild of Colonel, later Baron Arisaka. It's actually from Major, later General Nambu of pistol fame. He was one of Arisaka's understudies and took over and tried to improve the design. Even before the Russo-Japanese War, the shortcomings of the Type 30 were felt, and there was a lot of theory and whatnot. Then the war just kind of confirmed what they were already suspecting. The bolt was overly complicated. The rotating extractor and the ejector system wasn't the most durable or forceful, and as the environments in that part of Asia proved, it was very susceptible to dust and the action needed to be protected. Now, we looked at the Type 35 before in the manual dust cover. That was nominally thanks to Nambu, but wasn't something he was super keen on. So this was kind of a reworking of everything, the Type 38. And he took an already decent gun and an already decent cartridge and really made it into something quite special. First, the 6.5 by 50 semi-rimmed. Well, they didn't upscale it to 7mm or an 8mm, but they did soon go from the round nose to a Spitzer type bullet. It was lighter weight, a little more powder, so a little higher velocity, thus a little better range. It was an improvement while still letting them kind of keep on manufacturing what they were already doing. It made sense. And as I said in the Type 30 video, some of the Type 30s themselves were updated with Type 38 style rear sights. But the gun itself, yeah, we've got a lot of changes. The bolt was greatly simplified and strengthened, going from 9 to 10 parts in the Type 30 down to 6 parts. Really, if you think about it, only 4 parts when you go to remove it in the Type 38. We have an extractor that stays stable, rotates around the bolt. That improves things for oh so many ways. And we have, of course, the now famous automatic dust cover. Of course, on the Type 35, it's a manual one. On this, it slides with the action that we'll look at in a minute. He also improved the safety, going to the press-in style. There are 2 vent holes over the action to release gas in case of a ruptured cartridge. And this now uses a leaf spring in the magazine. Of course, I picked the one that's sticky. A lot of my guns still have a lot of cosmine in them. Instead of the old wire spring. Still fully removable, unlike on the later 99 where it's hinged. So a little bit of room for improvement later on there. But not a bad notion, all things considered. And we still have a trigger system derived from a Mauser. This whole thing is really patterned after the Mauser 1893 / Mauser 1895. But it's still cock on close. And the rifle had a barrel over 31 inches with an overall length of a little over 50 inches. And weight would kind of vary based on the wood type used and exact configuration and changes to the design. And it would take the same Type 30 bayonet, although it would be updated a little bit in its manufacturing tactics. We have sling swivels mounted on the bottom and a steel butt plate and flip-up sights with a fixed battle setting. Here it is with a random Type 30 bayonet I picked up, fitted, and yes, it is extremely long, well over 60 inches. I mean, this whole blade is, it's adding 1.5 feet. In the beginning, they would still have the hooked quillion, the hooked cross piece here. That would continue for quite some time. Moving back here, here's our bolt with the removable dust cover. Now, a Type 38 cover has this little piece riveted on the underside here in the back. A Type 99, in addition to being slightly different length, does not have that piece. So there's a difference in the covers. Here's our bolt. The big extractor that stays in the same position no matter how you rotate. And we have the press-in style safety that doubles as our disassembly. Blunk. This is 2 pieces welded together at the factory. And then from here, our firing pin, striker, and spring inside. The sound of machine steel, you gotta love it. Very well machined parts. And very high grade bluing on these too. And of course the dust cover would ride in the rails on the receiver. I'm sure you're aware of that. But figured why not show you. So, a vastly improved bolt system in terms of reliability, ease of maintenance, just everything. And even though these dust covers get maligned today, the truth is they're not bad at all. The accusation is that the dust cover here adds racket and noise. So I've removed the magazine because this has a last round holdback, and I wanted to activate the bolt with the dust cover off. And now we'll put the cover on and try that again. A lot easier to do when you're not at a weird angle, I tell you. Such is life, right guys? Yeah, hang on a sec, I'll be right back. Just a little case of sticky bolt. Pulling it out there, I just needed to be on the other side of it. Now, sometimes getting these covers lined up can be a little tricky, especially if it's not the serial match cover to your gun. Those are fitted to be not too tight, not too loose at the factory. They typically, you can interchange covers, but they might get sticky or sloppy. And so, here's this one. So you can hear it, but we're on a table with a mic. We're not in the field. And this one actually has a little rattle to it. The other gun I've got on the table actually fits much tighter. Could just be because it's got a lot of Cosmo on. So, as many people have rightly pointed out, it is not really an issue. And the dust cover is actually a pretty necessary piece of kit, and not one likely to be intentionally lost in the field. I wanted to also point out, this has a full-length cleaning rod, and it actually, you press in on your barrel band to pull it out. Like I said, it's a pretty darn full-length rod. So like on the 99, it doesn't screw in. It actually uses this little area here to simply snap in. A very thoughtful system, and lets the barrel band do double duty. See? I think it's neat. Again, we have standard sights. Nothing much there. It is just a very nice standard gun. All machined parts. We still have the double tang system first seen on the Type 30. We have a flat metal butt plate. And like I said, last round hold back when the magazine is empty. And we have a standard barrel band held on with a spring. And the spring for the front one is below. And we have a partial length top handguard. So with that, let's talk about production and changes over time. Since this was adopted nearly a decade before World War I, the Army and even the Navy had plenty of time to re-equip. This is why so many Type 38s, along with some Type 30s and even 35s, ended up first in Britain, where it was known as the Model 1907, and then of course later hundreds of thousands would end up in Russia. And they would even have foreign contracts, such as to Siam, Thailand, and even one that was to go to Mexico in 1913, but never did and ended up going to Russia. There's some interesting flavors and variants of this we can talk about on another time. In fact, most of them I have done a video in the past on. But these two, while they're both long rifles, infantry rifles, have changes. Now the first run was done at the Tokyo Artillery Arsenal, the Tokyo Army Arsenal, beginning in 1906 and running up through 1931-ish. This would be the single biggest run, with over 2 million assembled, with serial numbers climbing into 6 and 7 digits. But after World War I and the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, and Japan's imperial ambitions, let's say, in the 1920s and 30s, they decided to expand and separate their production. And so in 1932, 2 factories would take over Type 38 production. Kokura would take over directly from Tokyo, and Nagoya would start up a second line. Nagoya seems to have geared up a little bit before Kokura, but both were around 1932, 1933, and both would produce for almost a decade. Nagoya would build until 42, and Kokura would stop slightly earlier in 1941, meaning that they would kind of stop and transition over to the Type 99. During this late decade, Kokura would build just under 495,000 more, and Nagoya would build just over 312,000. Nagoya would also be charged with refurbishing, reworking, reassembling older guns. So that kind of explains the slightly lower numbers. Plus, Nagoya was working on the Type 99. It was developed there. So, limited resources. We would have smaller productions in what we know in China as Mukden, beginning in 1937 and running through 1944. They would actually build the last Type 38 rifles, and they would build just shy of 150,000. And the rarest and least common, of course, would be Jensen, who would only build a little over 13,000 in 1942 before switching over to the Type 99. So that kind of gives you a rundown of the rifles. So with that, the changes. And starting at this end, this is an early example with the straight butt plate. This is the late example with the cupped, so kind of Type 99 style butt plate. Kind of interesting. Sling swivels are about the same. The stocks are cut a little differently. This has more of a curve to it. This is a straighter cut. One that kind of jumps out at you really quick is the safety. This has what I call the convex safety. This pokes out, easily letting you know when the safety's on because it kind of obscures the sights. Later, they would go to the concave notched safety. And the sights would change too. This has a notch rear sight. And this has a true peep, a true aperture rear sight, kind of a triangle shape. It's a pretty big change, frankly. And it would be carried over to the front sights as well. This has an unprotected front blade. And this has the same basic blade, but now with the full protective ears. These ears would first appear on carbines, but I guess they felt at this point have them on rifles too. Another change that's really hard to quantify. Earlier stocks have a more rounded belly, and later stocks seem a little bit thicker, heavier, and more squared off. This is why determining an exact weight is a little difficult. Of course, these would have the royal chrysanthemum on the guns, some being defaced, others not. Some were canceled out, but when they were sold out of Japanese service, typically you would see little rings around it, or just overstamps. Depends on which contract and when it was. But they weren't all World War II defacements. Because this rifle, even though production was over by 1941-42 within Japan, very much served in the millions throughout the war. Although it should be said that the 6.5 caliber guns tended to go to mainland Asia, China, and other theaters, sending the 7.7s to fight in the Pacific against the Americans. That's a very general rule, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Flipping these back over, not much to look at here on this side. The cleaning rods changed slightly in their manufacturing. There was one interesting area on the receiver that's a little different here. There's a bit of a shelf or step above the release on the earlier one that is gone on the later one. It's a slight simplification of how they machined the receiver. So you'll see a few minor cost-saving measures like that, but nothing at all major. These did not have chrome-lined bores, and they all had a pretty high-grade blued finish because, again, they were pretty much all made either pre-war or early war. So that is far from all the Type 38s. It was certainly not just an infantry rifle. So let's look at some of the variations. Just as with the Type 30, there was a Type 38 carbine, and it was introduced right around the same time, like 1906, maybe just 6 months after the rifle. It was intended for cavalry, engineers, maybe artillerymen, second line people. It's slightly longer at 38 inches than the Type 30, with a slightly longer barrel at around 19 inches. I mean, just a tenth of an inch, maybe a fifth of an inch longer at most. And it weighs a little more as well, because we do finally have a upper handguard, actually a full length one, which is not what we saw in the original Type 30. It does have a bayonet lug as standard, short cleaning rod, protected front sight, shorter carbine rear sight. It has side sling mounts instead of on the bottom. And of course it has a dust cover. This has a convex safety, but it's a much smaller notch and located higher up. Otherwise it's pretty well the same. And just as we had with the rifle, this is an earlier example. There are later examples with the cupped butt plate and with the aperture rear sight and the concave safety. But this is mine. I've always kind of had a soft spot. It's a neat little gun. And the first run lasted up until about 1931, and that was Tokyo. And they would build roughly 210,000. Again, production would be taken over, but it would actually have a kind of a stall out period. Nagoya would not start building these until 1935, and Kokura would not do a run until 1938. Nagoya would build roughly 206,000, and Kokura would build roughly 50,000, a little less. These would also be assembled at Mukden between 1937 and 1944, and they would build a little over 52,000, give or take. So the majority were Tokyo, followed by Nagoya, with relatively small numbers of Kokura and Mukden, just to kind of supplement existing guns. All told, they would build between 517 and 518,000. So almost as many Type 38 carbines were built as Type 30 rifles. Flipping over, one kind of neat thing, instead of having one kind of long band spring here on the rifle, this has two shorter, fatter springs, one on each side for the band. I don't know, I kind of find that neat. Little changes like that always strike me as neat. Same style of cleaning rod, just of course shorter, because of course it would be. Why wouldn't it? And not much new to see on this side, two-piece stock. These are typically either beech or walnut, sometimes a few other more exotic woods. But Japan's wood access was not the greatest, not like North America, that's for sure. And these were used just by anyone who needed a shorter, lighter gun, and it was quite light. Whereas the rifle could approach 9 pounds, depending on configuration and everything. These little carbines could be as light as about 7.5 pounds. And they were a full foot shorter. And of course they could still mount the very long bayonet. It's not always the easiest to find one of these with the intact chrysanthemum too, though. I've had a lot of them in my life and had to make some tough decisions as to which one is a keeper. And of course these were popular bringbacks because they were handy to fit in a bag. Next up we come to one of the rarer guns in my Japanese collection. The intermediate length Type 38 Well, we call it a cavalry rifle. We don't really have a full formal designation. And these were not brand new factory built guns, but rather after the war in China was heating up for Japan in the 1930s, Nagoya, who was already refurbishing older Type 38s, was ordered to cut down some long rifles into what are effectively short rifles. The barrel was reduced from 31 inches to 25, although some have been reported with 24 inches too. And the forestock was shortened, and then of course the bayonet lug and band slid back, the cleaning rod shortened. Interestingly, the upper handguard was left the same because it didn't really matter, as was the rear sight. This one still has the peep aperture, and then dust cover, and still have the sling swivels on the bottom. Kind of reminds me of what we would think of as an engineer's carbine. But yeah, this was the intermediate length, kind of a forerunner of the Type 99 short rifle. Just in between everything else. Had an overall length of roughly 44 inches. And they were all cut down by Nagoya, we know that, with conversions occurring up through 1941 or 42. And estimates are that about 100,000 were converted, not any particular series or order, probably just based on the guns most eligible for the process. But many were lost, abandoned, captured, what have you, in China, and so never would make it over to the USA, meaning this, yeah, is one of my more interesting guns. Probably doesn't seem like much to a lot of people, but kind of completes the set here, giving you a long rifle, short rifle, and carbine. And now for the flip over. This one has the concave safety, like a lot of later ones, but it still has the straight butt plate. Again, it was an Arsenal rebuild, so yeah, I'm not going to say parts were or were not original to it. No chrysanthemum on this one, but considering how relatively uncommon the cavalry rifles are, I wasn't complaining. And the same spring clip holds on the band and the shortened cleaning rod, and it does have the protected front sight. But yeah, just kind of giving a versatility, kind of a lot of the same reason that Italy cut down a lot of its 91s into the 9124. That was actually a carbine. This is probably a more practical effort. But speaking of Italy, Japan would take some inspiration from them for our final gun too. Now we come to the Type 44, named after the 44th year, i.e. 1911. So a few years after the Type 38 carbine was out, and a really interesting variation. And you have to wonder if they didn't take a little bit of inspiration from the Italian 91 Cavalry carbine, because Italy really produced a lot of those. And that, of course, had its own underfolding style of bayonet. But this kind of takes it to another level. So the Type 38 carbine took the Type 30 bayonet, but cavalry would have their sabers. So maybe it seemed a little silly to either not have a bayonet at all or to carry two blades. So the major change, and we have two variants here. This is the first pattern, and this is the third pattern, is of course having this very beefy bayonet housing. So let's kind of talk about what makes it different. So we have this very large assembly with this very large, very easy to use push button for this cruciform style bayonet here. And that would lock forward and mean they did not have to carry a Type 30 bayonet. We have a pretty standard sling swivel, but it's changed a little bit in its angle to better work for the cavalry, kind of slanting down. We have a full-length top handguard, pretty standard rear sight. We have grooves in the stock. Of course, we have a protected front sight. Relatively standard receiver and dust cover. Interestingly, this one also has the small shelf above the takedown latch. This one has the convex safety. And we have a side mount for the sling. Now, of course, there's no cleaning rod under the barrel, so instead you have a unique buttstock and butt plate here with a trap door in it for a sectional cleaning rod. There's even a neat little rotating mechanism here. You can use a bullet edge in or some other tool to open up the door. Moving forward, pretty standard Arisaka from the side. And cut out here, and here's our long old bayonet deployed. It's a 3-edge, very thick device, and it has this hoop-to-hoop on the side. That's not a breaker. It's been pretty well known now, although for years people thought it was. It's actually to work as kind of a stacking system. It also is there to emulate the hook on the cross guard of the Type 30 bayonet in use at the time. It might have been useful in certain types of fighting, at least in theory. But it's a unique and very identifiable piece. Of course, this whole system, it's pretty beefy and does add a considerable amount of weight to the system, but probably less so and a little easier to use than carrying a separate Type 30 and its sheath, scabbard, what have you. Of course, the action is still the same. The rear section is, the same except for the different trapdoor in the butt plate. The Tokyo Arsenal would make the majority of these, 55,000, over a 2-decade run, so from 1911 through 1931. And all of the Tokyo guns were of the first pattern here. Note the location of the screws and relatively tight fit around the barrel. Those are two things very easy to identify. Then you look at the third pattern here. Note how far apart the screws are and how this comes up and laps around the upper more with just a tiny piece of wood on top. Also, the barrel is very loosely fit into this collar, this assembly. In fact, some have basically said it's free-floated, at least in theory. So, there's another difference back here, and another minor one. This had 2 holes in the stock for the cleaning system. This just has 1 big compartment instead internally. Not a big deal, but worth pointing out. There's also a bump on this butt plate in the middle. Not entirely sure why this one doesn't have it, but I don't know if that's just because of this gun. This one has the concave safety. This one has the convex, kind of the usual changes you expect between early and late Type 38 production. And again, after the Tokyo Arsenal would shut down, manufacturing would be picked up by Nagoya and Kokura. Kokura would start first, producing 8,000 second variation, which was a transitional, and that would be the first to have a wider area here, with really the big difference just being the location of this rear screw. On the second variation, it's a little further forward, right there. I've only actually ever had 1 second variation gun, and I had to sell it because they're just terribly uncommon. Plus, I do kind of find the third cooler. After that brief stint, they would transition at Kokura to the third variation with this very much reinforced area. And there were a couple of reasons for this. One, while the original Type 44 was well accepted, having all this stuff hanging off the muzzle didn't do great things for accuracy. This has the same 19-inch barrel as the Cavalry carbine, but they were noticing a little bit lower accuracy. And they theorized that having all this stuff hanging off would do it. So with this, it made less contact, less vibrations, yet it did improve accuracy. It also strengthened the wood, the forearm, because this was prone to cracking, and it also strengthened the bayonet mount, where twisting and turning would definitely not strip it off. It was just a much better supported system. So all around a net gain there. So Kokoro would do 13,000 third variations, supplementing the 8,000 second, giving them a total of 21,000. And then Nagoya would come in later and do another 13,000, and I'm just estimating, third variation guns. So you had roughly 26,000 of the third, 8,000 of the second, and then roughly 55,000 of the first. Now that's just kind of me giving, very rough estimations. And all told, it said that about 91,000 of these were built, including pretty much everything. So, not a tiny run, almost a full series, but quite small compared to the standard carbine, and just a handful, maybe less than the Cavalry rifle. And like the Cavalry rifle, these were very popular in the 1930s in China. They were said to be used in a lot of areas with poor roads where they had to go over mountains and stuff and carry it around, and potential close quarters fighting was on the table. Now, several would be used in the Pacific because a lot of these would be bring-back guns. So it does seem like a number would make it to the islands, but still a bulk would be in China. And older guns like this first type here would be refurbished, again, I believe by Nagoya, which is why you'll sometimes find a Type 44, which is immaculately deep bluing, just pretty as hell gun, except the mum will be scrubbed off, and that's because these are probably captured from the mainland, surrendered after the war. It's actually pretty difficult to find a Type 44 both with a mum and in great shape. It seems like you almost have to decide, do you want a little bit of honest wear and tear to be a battlefield pickup, or in a mum, or do you want a really pretty gun with a scrub mum? And I don't think there's a wrong decision there. Also, for some reason, a lot of Type 44s still have their dust covers. I don't know why, but I've probably run across more of these with dust covers than any other single variation. At any rate, just like the other Type 38s, production was over at Nagoya by 1942. And this really was a very popular variation. I'm a little surprised they didn't do a Type 99 style of this, but then again, by this time they were getting into the paratrooper guns, and this kind of took the place of it. Plus the old horseback cavalry were nearly a thing of the past at the time. And here we are at the end, back where we started. A lot of fun guns. Even though a few of these were made in 1942 and even a few in 1944, there really aren't any so-called last-ditch Type 38s. I'm not saying that maybe some of the very last ones weren't a bit cobbled together, but typically these maintain a very high quality of metal and wood finish and just overall craftsmanship. We don't know for sure how many were made, but roughly 3 million rifles, with another a little over 500,000 carbines, and then, like I said, a little over 90,000 of the 44s, and then 100,000 of the short rifles, although these were rebuilds from the other, giving us a total of, 3,500,000 to 3,600,000, give or take, all told. Best we can do. It's worth pointing out that when the rifle began, they were just doing serials because they were all produced at Tokyo. Once the 1930s rolled around and Kokura and Nagoya and then Mukden and Jensen got in, this is when the series began. With the Type 99s, of course, we know all the different series marks where they'd run up from 0 to 99,999. And they would do that with the later Type 38s, but the first 2 point some odd million were not. So only the last million or so were made under the series system. Still worth pointing out though, so you'll see mentions of series. I should also say that serial numbers and numbering get a little interesting with these because, as Japan did with other guns in the beginning, they used assembly numbers for some parts and serial numbers for others. So if you get an early gun and you see some numbers that don't seem to be matching, that may be a mismatch, or they could just be the assembly number vis-a-vis the serial. Although by the time you get to the later guns, then they're doing more of a standard serial system. So the assembly numbers will disappear in the 1930s for sure. And production was pretty low for all of these in the 1920s, partially because of the Great Kanto earthquake. Partially it was just the interwar period. But yeah, these have a very well-deserved reputation for having a very strong receiver. And there's very little to gripe about them. It's a very easy-to-use safety, even with gloves. Perfectly fine trigger, easy to field strip. And I would assert that the whole thing about the top covers, like this one's quite tight, is grossly overstated, frankly. It's not as big of an issue and whatnot. It's actually a very nicely made gun. Dare I say they took the Mauser and improved upon it. This would be one of the few bolt actions that really would be in the running for something superior to the Mauser. So I just felt like doing another deep dive today. Love to know what you think. As always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.